So I'm Chris Mantsavinos. I'm a professor of philosophy at the University of Athens. I'm going to chair the first session of the Delphi Dialogues, and this session hosts two speakers, Professor Ροϊλός and Professor Margetts. Professor Panagiotis Ροϊλός is the George Seferis Chair Professor of Greek Studies and Professor of Comparative Literature at Harvard. And since he is the president of the European Cultural Delphi Center, that is our host, I will not say more about his diverse accomplishments, but give him the floor after announcing the title of his talk, On Space Politics and the Future of Humanity.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Mantsavinos. Today, νεομεσιανισμός στα ελληνικά, in many parts of the globe is thriving and effecting unprecedented geopolitical reconfigurations. Neo-Messianism, the emergence and propagation of radical and fundamentally, or rather fundamentalistically, revisionist, aggressive political visions and practices, is a major constituent of what I have called neo-medieval metacapitalism. Political and economic leaders in the East and West, including so-called democratic countries, envision and promote drastic remappings of geopolitical balances, the creation of new disorders. Look, for instance, what's going on in our neighborhood as a result of Turkey's neo-Ottoman delirium or Russia's imperialistic frenzy, not to mention other countries. It might be a mere coincidence, although a sinister one, that in the past, comparable rhetoric and propaganda strategies were adopted by leaders of the most brutal totalitarian regimes that gave rise to the Second World War and the unparalleled resultant atrocities, most notably the Holocaust. One might have expected that humanity and its leaders should have emerged more humane, more mature, more judicious, less avaricious, less aggressive, and less self-destructive from the ordeals of that war and the unnerving antagonism of the almost half-century-long Cold War. Our era may also be described, I argue, in terms of Victor Turner's, the sagacious British anthropologist's, concept of anti-structural crisis. That is, a crisis that brings into question dominant societal and political structures during which antagonism reaches its peak. In the last quarter of a century, global politics, economics, societal structures, behavioral patterns find themselves in what feels as a perpetual or rather self-reproducing meta-crisis. From September 11th to the market crisis in 2008-2009 in the West, to the pandemic and the war in Ukraine, and currently the war with Iran and the new disruption of world economy. Anti-structural processes are accompanied by, or rather, constitute forms of transformative liminality, which often has radical defamiliarizing effects, to say the least. The old is redefined or even eventually supplanted by something new. The repeated emphasis in the rhetoric of neo-messianic politicians and businessmen today on the new order or orders of things, which to the ears of some historically informed and sensitive listeners might at times, perhaps rather exaggeratedly, of course everything depends on the context, that echo the Nazi propagation of Neuordnung, is thus not fortuitous. It should be viewed and evaluated within these broader parameters of the anti-structural competition with the old and the dramatic emergence of the new. However, structuralist approaches and interpretations entail several hermeneutic and political risks. Let me mention just a couple. First, they tend to posit clear-cut antitheses and taxonomies, while understating or ignoring the significance of gray zones. The fact that human societies, especially in neo-medieval meta-capitalism, are exceptionally complex, rarely abiding to laws of general applicability. I would dare to argue that perhaps a remarkable exception that appears to be relevant to most human societies is the law, or rather the descriptive pattern, of schismogenetic formation of power relations between different groups of people at different scales of human interaction: interpersonal, interregional, transnational, international. Second, structuralist approaches do not pay equal attention to fluctuating and free-floating factors, including the aleatory, the unforeseeable. Already, almost a century ago, but much more systematically in the last 8 decades or so, that is after the Second World War, and of course during the Cold War, ideological and international schismogenetic competition, that is to say antagonistic competition, began to be transferred from aggressive competition, began to be transferred from geopolitics to space politics, and from the Earth to the outer space. Conquering the space was a vision that fed into the rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union in the post-war era. But exploring and colonizing extraterrestrial territories seems to have inspired human imagination since very ancient prehistoric times, as is indicated in pictorial records. The nebula sky disk, which you're seeing here on the screen, discovered in the eponymous town in Germany, not very far from the city of Helen, Saale, is an elegant early example of humans' attempt to depict astronomical objects or real phenomena. It has been argued, and of course, Avi, Professor Loeb, Professor Krimizis, and Professor Martin Rees, I'm not a specialist in astronomy or in the study of outer space, but it has been argued that that disk, which was made sometime between the 18th and 16th century BC, may also represent a vehicle that could be viewed as a solar boat, a spaceship. You know, some researchers think that this shape here depicts some sort of imagined spaceship. Almost 2 millennia after the manufacture of that object, in the 2nd century CE, Lucian, a witty Syrian writing in Greek, the lingua franca of his time, composed what arguably was the first extensive science fiction in world literature, his novel, A True Story full of lies, though, as Lucian says. Among other extraordinary extraterrestrial visits and experiences, the protagonist in Lucian's work narrates a spectacular war between the inhabitants of the sun, the so-called Sunites in the established English translation, and the inhabitants of the moon, the Moonites. This is a depiction of this fight published in an early 17th century Latin edition of this novel in the Netherlands. The conflict, a Lucianic prefiguration of George Lucas's Star Wars cinematic saga, ended with a treaty between the two extraterrestrial countries, Avi. Each formulation is a parody of relevant documents. So I'm going to read you just a few sentences from that parodic treaty between the inhabitants of the moon and the inhabitants of the sun. So the treaty reads as follows. On the following conditions, the Sunites and their allies make peace with the Moonites and their allies, to wit. Each country should aid the other if it be attacked. The colony on the morning star should be planted in common, and that anyone else who desires may take part in it, etc., etc. I'm not going to read the whole passage. Lucian science fiction predated by 17th centuries the very famous Jules Verne's novel From the Earth to the Moon, a direct route in 97 hours and 20 minutes, which was published in 1865. However, the latter, Verne's science fiction, could boast of predicting with admirable approximation the time that took Apollo 11 to land to the moon. It missed the actual duration of the American spacecraft's trip to the moon only by 5 hours. More than 2 centuries before the publication of Verne's novel, the pioneer German astronomer Johannes Kepler published a science fictional work in Latin entitled Somnium, that is, dream. In it, he described his own version of a trip to the island of the moon, apparently inspired by Lucian. The great astronomer Carl Edward Sagan and Isaac Asimov were great admirers of Kepler's science fiction. Carl Edward Sagan was an exceptionally influential scientist, and his case illustrates how charismatic human intelligence, if combined with sensitive, advanced human imagination, can lead to extraordinary scientific achievements. Perhaps in popular culture, he is best known as the author of the science fiction Contact, on which the 1997 homonymous Hollywood movie was based, but it was his scientific contributions that secured him rare and long-lasting international fame. Suffice it to mention only his leading role in, among other pioneering projects, the Voyager program. A keen researcher also of the possibility of extraterrestrial life, Sagan played a fundamental role in the preparation of the so-called Pioneer plaques placed on the Pioneer 10 in 1972 and Pioneer 11 in 1973 spacecrafts, and the Voyager Golden Record. The latter, among many other visual and sound messages, includes the following message in ancient Greek. Ήτινες πότε έστε χαίρετε, ειρηνικός προς φίλους ελιλήθαμεν φίλοι. Greetings to you, whoever you are. We come in friendship to those who are friends. Emphasis on peace and collaboration is a recurrent topos also in several nations and international organizations' declarations concerning missions to space and its explorations. It constitutes, for instance, an important objective of the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space of the United Nations, established by the General Assembly of the United Nations on the 13th of December 1958, as it stated in its resolution 1348-13. Founded in the middle of the Cold War, the rationale and the purview of that committee are indicated in that resolution as follows, quote, the General Assembly, recognizing the common interest of mankind in outer space, and recognizing that it is the common aim that our outer space should be used for peaceful purposes, wishing to avoid the extension of present national rivalries into this new field, desiring to promote energetically the fullest exploration and exploitation of outer space for the benefit of mankind, conscious that recent developments in respect to outer space have added a new dimension to man's existence and opened new possibilities for the increase of his knowledge and the improvement of his life, recognizing the importance of international cooperation in the study and utilization of outer space for peaceful purposes, establishes an ad hoc committee on the peaceful uses of outer space, end of quote. Similar is the spirit that permeates the description of the mission of Asia-Pacific Space Cooperation Organization, APSCO. Members of this organization are Bangladesh, China, Iran, Mongolia, Pakistan, Peru, Thailand, and Turkey. However, The active exploration of the outer space has mainly been undertaken at a national level. Individual states, great powers, invest considerable amounts of their annual budgets in space projects. The United States spends around $80 billion every year for space programs. This amount concerns both the NASA and the US Space Force initiatives. China allocates around $20 billion annually to space programs, Japan $7 billion, France around $4.5 billion, Russia $4 billion, the EU 2.1 billion euros, while the European Space Agency, ESA, approximately 8.3 billion euros. ESA is an independent agency and its funds come mainly from its 23 state members. Obviously, the lack of international body that would bring together, coordinate, and fund such initiatives is indicative of the highly competitive character of the projects initiated and supported by individual countries or intergovernmental unions like the EU. Despite appeals to peace and emphasis on the pan-human objectives of those projects, those political entities represent and promote mainly, and perhaps understandably so, their own respective economic, political, geopolitical, space, political, and military priorities. In that respect, the US Space Force, which was founded in 2019, thus being the newest branch of United States Armed Forces, describes its mission in realistic and sincere terms. Quote, while the US Space Force is the youngest branch of US Armed Forces, its mission is direct continuation of the enduring legacy of the US Armed Forces. Space has become a critical war-fighting domain where the ability to operate freely is essential to national sovereignty. Guardians ensure the United States and its allies and partners can access and operate in space without interference, denying adversaries the ability to challenge the freedoms first secured at the nation's founding. The Space Force carries forward the revolutionary mindset that victory depends not just on strength, but on ingenuity, pioneering technologies and strategies that secure advantage in an increasingly contested domain. End of quote. More than a year ago, in April 2025, the US Space Force released a very important document entitled Space Warfighting, a Framework for Planners. In the foreword to that document, the United States Chief of Space Operations stressed, quote, since the first satellite launched into orbit in 1957, space has increasingly become the foundation of modern life. Accordingly, military space operations have become the backbone of the joint force enabling long-range kill chains and global power projection. However, in the face of growing threats in, from, and to space, access to the domain can no longer be taken for granted. For this reason, it is the formative purpose of the Space Force to achieve space superiority, to ensure freedom of movement in space for our forces, while denying the same to our adversaries. In short, space warfighting operationalizes two core Space Force truths. We must defend United States space capabilities, and we must protect our forces from space-enabled attack. Space superiority is not only a necessary precondition for joint force success, but also something for which we must be prepared to fight. To that end, our nation depends on us to organize, train, and equip space forces ready and able to conduct space warfighting operations. We must be prepared to employ capabilities for offensive and defensive purposes to deter and, if necessary, defeat aggressors that threaten our vital national interests." End of quote. This is a very candid, very straightforward document, which is certainly matched by similar visions and strategical plannings of the other great powers as well. And this leaves no doubt that militarization of the space, its colonization, and of course, the exploitation of its potential resources are at the very core of space politics today. Let me conclude this basic outline of space politics today with a few points. First, the exploration and potential colonization of the outer space, the interstellar adventures of humans, should not happen at the expense of the protection of our planet and the quality of the life of humans on it. Investing, for instance, in the reversal of the climate change should be at least an equal priority for all great powers as their antagonistic engagement with the study and exploitation of extraterrestrial territories. Second, this engagement should not reproduce the conflictual geopolitical relations on our planet. This is, of course, a romantic vision. Reality is quite different. Space politics often mirrors real geopolitik. In fact, these two levels of realpolitik, geo and space politik, are inextricably connected and further immersed in complex, mainly economic, but also ideological and social nexuses, often promoting the interests of colossal private businesses or, at the best, of specific nations. Third, as a rule, geopolitics and space politics are entangled in a vicious circle of economic antagonism. Space-related industry is in need of rare earth elements, as we all know. China is the nation that currently produces by far the largest bulk of such elements. Greenland, this rings a bell, is the house of very large rare earth reserves. Hence, recent discussions about the ownership of that huge territory on the planet Earth. Rare earth reserves on Earth are necessary for the continuation and expansion of space industry, which in its turn, in the not too distant future, will enable the systematic search for and perhaps eventual exploitation of such reserves in the space, most probably and perhaps most feasibly on the moon, although I'm not a specialist, but as far as I have seen, research on that front has not been very encouraging so far. But the most important question remains, who should own the space? Or even, should there be such a concept as the ownership of something like the outer space that at least now and in the near future by and large lies and will lie far beyond the immediate experiential purview of the vast majority of humans? Answers to this question depend mainly on political, ideological, and ethical priorities. Quite often we forget ethics. Idealists would most probably support the view that we should do away with the very notion of space ownership, or at least that this ownership should be shared by humanity, mankind as a whole. But more realistic and down-to-earth people would point to the history and international geopolitics on the planet Earth, where realpolitik tends to carry the day and espouse this approach. My own, I know, very naive and romantic wish is that such a day of outer space realpolitik may not rise on yet another celestial extraterrestrial body. But I, of course, know that this is yet another midsummer afternoon's dream. Human history, not unlike Lucian's seriously parodic true story, indicates that schimogenesis, conflict, antithesis, division, formed our past, dominate our present, and appear to be shaping up also the potential interstellar future of our species. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the wonderful talk. Now we turn to the second speaker of our session, to Professor Margetts. Helen Margetts is Professor of Society and the Internet at the University of Oxford. From her long CV, I will just name the titles of 3 of her books. Digital Era Governance, with Oxford University Press 2008. Political Turbulence, How Social Media Shape Collective Action, with Princeton 2017. And her forthcoming book, AI and Digital Governance. The title of her today's talk is AI and Digital Era Governance. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and it is a great honor to be here in Delphi with you. I'm going to talk about government, and therefore I must convince you that that is just as interesting and just as important as the sun and the moon. So I have set myself a big task. I want to start by saying that democratic governments are under pressure. We can see that everywhere we look. And part of the reason for that is that this century has seen 2 major technological disruptions. First, from the internet and social media. Second, from artificial intelligence and the powerful large language models that have been unleashed into society. Actors ranging from individual citizens to huge technology companies the size of countries and organized anti-democratic forces are all taking advantage of these technologies. But democratic governments are struggling to keep pace. I'm going to talk about a model of government, the digital era governance model, which will help governments to navigate these stormy conditions. The digital era governance model offers a route to maximize the potential of AI technologies to govern effectively and intelligently, to improve public sector productivity and services, and to keep the public safe. The future of humanity is going to depend on states' ability to govern in the age of artificial intelligence and the technologies that accompany it. The model that I will talk about, Digital Era Governance, or DEG, was developed by Patrick Dunleavy from the London School of Economics and myself, and it has grown into one of the foundational perspectives in modern public governance. As the chair said, we first defined it in a 2006 book, and also an article called New Public Management is Dead, Long Live Digital Era Governance. The book has received 1,900 citations. The article has received over 5,000 citations. And the moral of that story is, for the scholars in the audience, don't write books. Write articles with really good titles.
Or perhaps don't write books after you get tenure. This is what American academics would say.
Anyway, undeterred, we're going to write another book, and that's what I'm going to talk about. So the DEG approach focuses on how successive waves of technological change impact upon the organization of the state and public services. Previous waves of governance change include e-government, online government services, and digital by default. But we are now in a radical third wave of data-intensive change. It's driven by data science, robotics, and AI, and it entails extensive transformations of public governance in 4 key ways, and I will talk about those in turn. First of all, the data-intensive information regime. Data science, big data, cloud computing, AI have all radically increased government's capability to store and analyze large quantities of digital data. This is a real break for the past for government. If you think about it, traditionally, bureaucracy was based on what Weber called the files. The equivalent of a paper or more recently, digital filing cabinet. Very good for looking up individual cases, but yielding no transactional data for analysis, no usable data for analysis. With data science and AI, governments can make use of their own treasure troves of transactional data that they get through routine interactions with citizens and firms, and they can use that to govern more intelligently. The data-intensive information regime increases the capacity of government to understand social and economic trends and to shape the world outside. Policymakers can use AI tools to detect patterns of behavior that signal problems. If you think about it, every failing institution, every failing hospital, failing school generated some data somewhere which could have been analysed to work out the problems developing. There are new ways to measure economic performance. We tend to rely on custom-built official statistics which kind of lock our indicators in the past. Whereas there's new ways to measure things like inflation, so we can measure them in real time, and we can measure their differential effect on different types of a citizen according to their socio-economic circumstances. AI technologies can help to optimize resources or to forecast adverse events, extreme weather, riots, financial crises. They can be used to simulate policy interventions so that we can try out policies before putting them into practice, so that we can avoid unintended consequences of untested policies. In public services, large language models are already being used to increase bureaucratic productivity. The second transformation, which I want to argue for, is the use of robotics. The increasing capability of robotic devices, including drones and other semi-automated delivery machines, has really expanded the range of tasks where machines can extend or substitute workers' capabilities. The conventional assumption is that significant deployments of robotics in civilian government is years away. There are actually no articles on the topic in public administration journals. But there are potentially radical implications for the reshaping of state organisation, which we already see in defence, and we argue that that is going to transfer to civilian government also. If you think about the Russian attack on Ukraine and subsequent war, it's seen an unprecedentedly rapid development of drone technology and other robotics. With Ukraine developing 4 million mainly cheap and decentralized drones every year, drones now account for 3/5 of casualties on both sides of the conflict. Drone swarm technologies have already largely outclassed tanks, artillery, and perhaps even attack helicopters, and shattered the conventional ships of the Russian Black Seas fleet. Rapid development of anti-drone counter-weapons and jamming systems has gone along with panoplies of different drone types. Small, ultra-low-cost, decentralized devices and high-end centrally controlled drone accompaniments to conventional planes, ships, and submarines. So military robotics has in just a few years extensively obsolesced much of the really expensive defense equipment and force formations of Western liberal democracies. The driver here is a hunter-finder competition for survival. One side develops a technology and the other side must develop it also. But similar pressures are at play in civilian government. Public agencies are competing for the attention of citizens, of policymakers, of legislators, and we will see the same developments there. There are already strong signs that there will be rapid and extensive spillovers from military applications into homeland security, law and order. Think about it, when prisoners are using drones to export drugs into prison, then the state has to develop a response, which will either be drones or counter-drones. In environmental and physical territorial regulation, immigration control, counter-terrorism, we'll see similar pressures in all those areas. In health, pressure for robotization will come from the progress of consumer electronics and the accumulation of massive databases of health information by companies like Apple. With more and more citizens self-monitoring health patterns, who else is counting their steps every day on their phone? It's a matter of time before public healthcare facilities and hospitals will need to develop ways of interacting with devices, with our devices. The third transformation I want to talk about is state restructuring. It tends to be a long time since anyone asked the who does what question in modern states. Fundamental allocations have been historically or constitutionally fixed at the founding moment, possibly re-examined at any refounding moments after wars, civil wars, or state collapse. But once a modern state is defined, its original allocation of functions tend to stick. We would argue that the need to respond to technological change suggests new institutional logics in two key ways. First, vertically. In vertical policy sectors, we need an architecture which has an intelligence center and a devolved delivery architecture. Modern corporations, especially platform companies like Amazon, have created massive data handling and analytics at the corporate center, but also highly decentralized systems for delivering goods and services at the local level. Most states are the mirror image of that structure, and we need to think about the functional allocation pressures at work in democratic states. Within vertical policy sectors, centralizing, networking, high-scale digital processes need to be focused at the national level. Services solely delivered at local scales, but with access to the intelligence center for information. An example of how this might work, again, rather a long way away from the sun and the moon, is library provision. In England, in recent decades, over 100 main councils deliver local library services where people can borrow books and e-books. But each of these over 100 councils orders their own books. And that means they pay way over the odds prices than they would get from supermarkets or online book suppliers. It also achieves really low level of local diversity. Library stocks show that 85% of books at local level are the same across local authority areas. An alternative solution here might be a national UK agreement say with Google Play or Amazon Kindle, to deliver electronic books to citizens in exchange for micropayments or subscriptions paid by the local area. Intelligence Centre devolved delivery. The other institutional logic that changes is in horizontal tiers of government. A kind of administrative holism. Power should be allocated horizontally. Modern governments need state integration in AI capabilities. They need a technology-shaped re-specialization of public governance. But they don't need that for the whole, or they could never attain that for the whole government. They need it across horizontal tiers of government. Regulation is a really good example of where administrative holism is needed. AI is reshaping every market, every area of society. That means all regulators are to some extent AI regulators now. But that's a big shock to some regulators. Imagine you work for the Equalities and Human Rights Commission or the Electoral Commission. You never expected to be a technology regulator. But you need capabilities in AI, which is virtually impossible for every smaller regulator to acquire. Larger regulators, like telecommunications regulators, like Ofcom in the UK, have started to build up really impressive AI expertise. They've long dealt with social media platforms and telecommunications companies. That capability, that expertise needs to be shared across tiers of government. There's a need for AI expertise to be pooled, shared, and deployed in ways that sustain frontier capacities for all agencies in that tier. We need common capacity in AI regulation as AI diffuses across, even further across markets. The final transformation underway is about what we call nodality or centrality, visibility in information networks. That's a key lever for policymakers to shape the world outside government. The greater a government's nodality or centrality, the more likely that it can use information alone to influence societal behaviour. Think about the pandemic. Every single government had to get information out to citizens. They wanted citizens to stay at home or keep their distance. But if they wanted to do that, they had to tell people about the spread of the disease. They had to tell the people about risks for different age groups and indicators of disease spread. They had to make citizens aware of rule changes or the availability of subsidies or services and so on. It was absolutely crucial for governments to be able to get information out to people, and many governments had press conferences, government press conferences every day to try to do that. But in this technological era, there's a challenge there for government. Governments used to possess centrality or nodality uniquely by being government. They were like the watchtower or the watermill in society's information networks, the Rome to which all roads lead. But in a digital world, and in particular in an AI-powered world, governments face much stiffer competition in information networks, much stiffer competition for public attention. They face competition from mainstream media outlets, from social media platforms, from AI companies and technology companies of all time. They face competition from citizens themselves, from misinformation and anti-democratic actors. They face competition from public figures, followed by millions of people. A couple of examples. Marcus Rashford, a British footballer who you will be seeing on your screens in the World Cup, although probably not very much longer, was able to announce the government, was able to convince the government during the pandemic to fund free school meals for children during the holidays, which they weren't getting before. It's very unusual to have a footballer making policy, but he guilt-tripped the government using his millions of followers on Twitter, now X, with a hashtag holidays without hunger. He guilt-tripped the government into providing the free meals themselves. There are lots of public figures who have greater followings than government do and offer real competition to government. Governments are also very dependent and have long been used to being dependent on big technology platforms like Google. Optimizing for search engines is something that governments have done for a while. But now their centrality or their capacity to get information out has been taken over to some extent by large AI companies. If you think about it, somebody sits at ChatGPT or Claude looking for government information, looking for information about policies or public health or climate change or something like that. The government has no control over what information they get. The information is provided by ChatGPT or Claude. Government doesn't know what people are getting. They can't control what people are getting. And if the information changes, say a new rule, a new policy, a new measure of inflation, they cannot be sure they can get it out to people. So that's a big shift. Perhaps most importantly, though, citizens themselves, and I am going to end on a bit of a positive note, citizens themselves are digitally enabled in new and exciting ways, particularly now they can interact with AI. This was already something that began to happen with social media. As the chair mentioned, I wrote a book called Political Turbulence about the dynamics of how citizens were using social media to organize, to coordinate, to mobilize, and to act collectively to campaign for policy change. Now large language models give citizens new types of capacity, analytic capacity, capacity to scrutinize public sector processes and hold government to account. Who hasn't used a large language model to write a letter of complaint or a query that sounds a little bit like you're a lawyer? Not really a lawyer, but it makes you sound a little bit like you're a lawyer. These are new forms of citizen vigilance. The importance for public management systems is that citizens can share information, shape public discussion of issues, and introduce virally relevant knowledge that spans right across large populations. A globally significant example was the video clip of George Floyd's death at the hands of police in Minneapolis, Minnesota in 2020. That video clip was taken by a perfectly normal teenager, Darnella Frazier, on her way to work. The clip was viewed and shared by hundreds of millions of people. She was awarded a citation from the Pulitzer Board for her journalistic contribution. It fed into the ultimate conviction of Floyd's killer. It sparked nationwide protests over US policing practice and ultimately led to some kind of policy change, at least temporarily. We are seeing similar cases of citizen vigilance challenging the US state in Minneapolis today. The deaths of Rennie Good and Alex Pretty, for example, highlighted by ordinary people again and again and amplified by Bruce Springsteen. This rise in citizen nodality and centrality means that citizens themselves provide the primary guarantee of sustaining a limited and accountable political and constitutional system. Citizens can exercise never-ceasing vigilance over the behaviour of elected or appointed politicians, administrative elites and lower ranks of officials, calling out lapses from democratic and ethical standards of behaviour. In the book, we have written about how this citizen vigilance could lead to a revival of Republican values and a new era of republicanism. I told you there was a positive end.
I should have acknowledged, sorry, I'm interrupting the regular flow of the panel because I should have acknowledged the presence here of the former president of the Academy of Athens, Professor Krimizis, who is a pioneering scientist of outer space, also of the director of the Elementary Education Service of the region, Ms. Amalia Papaioannou, and of course, the over, I think, 35 journalists who have become very, very faithful fans of the Delphi Dialogues. So thank you for being with us today. Sorry.
That's okay. Thank you very much for this excellent talk. Now the floor is open for some questions, 3 or 4 questions we will take because we are running out of time. So please, who wants to start?
Can I ask Helen? Thanks, Helen, for this admirable presentation. I learned a lot. What about the negative notes of the usage of the AI by governments? So the possible negative aspects of the use of AI in governments.
Yeah, I should stress, I mean, I was talking about governments that are trying to be democratic. Yes. Of course, governments can use AI to be undemocratic and to be authoritarian. I should point out, though, we tend to assume that this is going to happen. There have, after all, been very successful authoritarian governments and dictatorships which have managed very well without technology. Bureaucracy itself is an admirable tool for surveillance and authoritarianism. And I think that AI is not different from bureaucracy in that respect, that if a government is using it to be authoritarian, it will be successfully used.
So we take these 2 questions, please. It's coming.
Yes, so you refer to the Space Force, and indeed it's practical to perhaps fight over space very close to Earth, but once we go far from Earth, even to the moon, there is a question of who will enforce any authority or law. Going to Mars might be even more difficult. There we would have a clean slate for establishing a society based on new principles if we go there. But farther away, there is no way to police what people would do.
There's no way to what? To police people.
Yeah. So how do you envision authority when going to space, or will it be like the Wild West? Everyone can get whatever they can, and that will be it.
First of all, let me say that I'm really honored that I am asking a question by word authority in the study of outer space. Professor Avi Lord. Okay, Avi, as you don't have many answers for many questions, I don't have any specific answers. But my point is that worth exploring and worth coming up with some, especially you, people in your field, but also in collaboration with people in the law, in the social sciences, and please don't leave out also humanists, because I think that they could offer some quite often very useful critical perspectives on what you're doing. So it's worth exploring, as worth exploring is, of course, the world out there. My point is that, of course, ideally, any kind of exploration of outer space should happen as that very romantic declaration of that committee of the United States indicates for the whole of the mankind. So ultimately, eventually, this is in the hands of politicians. It's not in the hands of humanists, social scientists, or not even, I guess yourself or, scientists in your field. My point is that all of us as citizens should become alert to these possibilities and also to the need for, I think, international collaboration in these interstellar adventures of mankind. So this is my point. I don't have any solutions. I have concerns and this kind of romantic vision.
Thank you.
Thank you for two wonderful talks. I did want to say I laughed hard when I saw the space warfighting, a framework for planners. Who writes their plan when they go to fight? That's kind of weird for me, but I did want to ask Helen a question. You talked about the data-intensive information and the disruptions that we're facing. I did wonder, in the data-intensive information regime that we are, what about AI slop? How are we dealing with that?
You mean AI-generated slop and misinformation? Yeah, I mean, AI has the potential to turbocharge any of the harms that we became familiar with social media. Misinformation, organized disinformation, conspiracy theories, all those things have been turbocharged with AI. But the data-intensive information regime is based on is based on the data that government collects from citizens as it goes about its business, and that information, I think, is relatively kind of is independent of the AI slop. Where there's a problem, though, where the two come together, is that we're going to see a huge rise in complaints and people putting pressure on government, which may well not be slop, but governments will find really hard to deal with that because they're not used to dealing with that kind of volume of content. So that is going to be a problem. But yeah, the challenge of kind of indifferent organization, the question of how to identify the good information, I think is going to be, is obviously a challenge for citizens going forward, yes.
Thank you. So we take the last question.
Thank you. Should I introduce myself? If so, my name is Dimitris Mourtis. I'm professor in the University of Patras, working several years on the issue of AI, of real AI. So, if we are talking about artificial intelligence, we talk about algorithms, context, data, and computing power, let's say, some basic pylons of what is related to artificial intelligence.
Louder, please, because... Yeah.
Excuse me?
Speak up.
Yeah, okay. So, but as you know, without data, there is no discussion about artificial intelligence. But the data at this point of time are owned in the amount of required for creating real AI applications by some companies like Amazon, Google, IBM, Dassault, and so forth. So the question is, for all panelists, what do you think about the, let's say, challenges which we will face for the accumulation of data, real or synthetic data, in 3, 4, 5, 10 big players all over the world?
This for you.
I'm actually going to answer that also with reference to the last question, because I mean, I will say something that I'm worried about. My job title in Oxford is professor, at the moment, is Professor of Society and the Internet. My department is called the Oxford Internet Institute. I'm a huge believer in the Internet, and I'm worried that AI will cause problems for the Internet, particularly because of the phenomenon that you mentioned. The fact that the next generation of AI is there is a danger that it's going to be trained on lots of data generated by AI. And this is going to degrade what we see on the Internet. It's going to degrade amazing sort of collective endeavors like Wikipedia and so on. And I think that is something that we should worry about. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, I'm by no means a specialist in AI, as you all know. But I would also point to the dangers of the use and proliferation and reproduction of biased algorithms as well. And this is an issue that has been explored systematically among several other scholars by a colleague of ours, of Reed and Avi, at Harvard, Professor Latanya Sweeney at the Harvard Kennedy School. So, you know, sorry? Which is your department? Okay, sorry, yes. So, you know, fighting biased algorithms, I think, is a huge challenge, which will become even bigger and challenging in the future, you know, with the proliferation of the use of AI, etc. Am I correct, Helen?
But wherever there is AI, there is always the danger that it will be biased,
So.
and it will reinforce existing biases, yes, definitely.
Please join me in thanking the speakers. Please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Panagiotis. So I'm Marcus Gabriel. I'm a professor of philosophy at the University of Bonn and the University of Kyoto, and I have the pleasure and honor of chairing the second session of the Delphi Dialogues. So first, let me just briefly introduce, because we have extensive bio notes in the program, Professor Škof from Slovenia, who, among many other things, has been publishing on the philosophy of breath and how it relates, of course, to the psyche. the soul, a topic that I find increasingly more important as we're facing, the potentially age of soulless machines. And he'll be speaking to us today precisely about the future soul of humanity. Looking forward, welcome Professor Škof.
So, thank you very much. Can you hear me? A bit louder. I will put it closer. So thank you very much for the invitation. First, maybe I would need to put a question mark to my title, The Future Soul of Humanity, but hopefully the question mark will still not be needed. The future will show us. I'm bringing greetings from my city, of my institute, of our institute, Koper, Capodistria. This is why I put the statue of Ioannis Kapodistrias, whose family is from, of course, from our city. But let me begin this lecture. Yes. Yes. Okay. Thank you for reminding me. In collaboration between Science and Research Center Koper and the European Center of Delphi, we have just inaugurated the so-called Kapodistrias Residential Fellowship, and the call for proposals is currently open. Thank you. So this lecture is from the point of view of humanities and narrowly, of course, from the point of view of philosophy. The title of, and let me just try to navigate through my slides. I will not read all of them. I will just put them and read maybe a sentence or two. This should serve as a motto or an introduction to my lecture. Ilia Delio is a Franciscan sister. She has a dual PhD from neuropharmacology and theology, and she somehow depicts in this passage what went wrong in the 20th century. But let me begin with a recent Big Think article in which Shaitu Bali engages with the renowned neuroscientist and professor of cognitive and computational neuroscience, Anil Seth, on the profound differences between human minds and artificial ones. The central inspiration for the article is Seth's visit to an aquarium in the heart of Naples, where he spent a week observing a dozen octopuses. We know that these are highly intelligent creatures, intelligence being understood here in a sense that we compare with Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, Cosmical Evolutionary Vision of Intelligence. According to Seth, and judging from what we can observe ourselves, the octopus is closer to an alien life form than to anything else we are likely to encounter on this planet. He's referring to the remarkable diversity of its organization, behavior, and interaction with its environment. The central claim of his reflections is, though, that the common assertion that the brain is like a computer or a machine is simply too narrow and, in some respects, potentially dangerous for our species. We need a different perspective, one that is broader, more nuanced, and more attentive to the richness of living intelligence. Yet this mechanization of the mind is closely connected to the way we conceive of the soul and how we understand ourselves as living and thinking and breathing beings. Conversely, this outlook profoundly shapes the way we design and interpret AI and more generally intelligence as such. And here begins our story. The history of the soul is also a history of forgetting and neglecting many dimensions of our creativity, affectivity, and sensibility. These dimensions remain hidden beneath the grandiose and ultimately tragic, given its consequences, presumption of our intellectual exclusivity. Let me quote from the article already mentioned. If all that matters is the algorithm, the brain's metabolism, and living texture can begin to look like mere implementation detail, and so forth. So what is the soul, and where did we go wrong in conceptualizing the history of human cognition, our epistemological endeavors, and our engagement with the reality that surrounds us? Is our ontology merely a reflection of a functionalist and mechanistic conception of the mind, or is there another, more encompassing way of understanding the world? One possibility is suggested by my dearest thinker, Giordano Bruno, and his notion of the vinculum, a hidden bond or coordination among beings that cannot be reduced to visible things, yet is somehow secretly present throughout the cosmos. Such a perspective points towards an understanding of intelligence in cosmic and perhaps even divine terms, transcending the conflicts of confines of mechanistic explanations and inviting us to reconsider the deeper interconnectedness of reality. Now, the next section is called The Forgetting of the Body and the Secret Life of the Breath. Yes. Yes, I'm returning right now. The history of the soul, or at least the history of the soul in Western philosophy and more broadly in Western thought, is a history of a certain forgetting. It is a history marked by the eclipse or overshadowing of a body and the elevation of the immaterial soul to center stage of our thinking. For me, however, as a respiratory philosopher or a philosopher of breath, this question concerns not only metaphysics but also ontology and ethics. What then is the soul? When reflecting on cognition and knowledge, we are accustomed to employing concepts such as soul, spirit, mind, substance, reason, intellect, and consciousness. All of these terms point in different ways to our capacity for thought, a capacity that has often been understood as essentially and methodologically at least detached from the body. The story behind this unfortunate gesture is the familiar trajectory of Western thought, stretching from Plato to Augustine and from Descartes to Kant. Now, in one of his letters, Descartes stated that, and I'm quoting this from Derrida, "I breathe, therefore I am," concludes nothing, if it has not been proven previously that one exists, or if one does not imply. I think that I breathe, even if I'm mistaken in this, therefore I am. And it is nothing other to state in this sense, I breathe, therefore I am, than I think, therefore I am. Thinking, therefore, comes before being alive, before we breathe, relate to our bodies, and encounter others as co-breathing beings, for Descartes. We can come to know ideas only through the light of, as it were, pure reason, such as in Kant, and what we must leave behind is a vast reservoir of somatic knowledge that remains hidden, buried, or forgotten in the depths of our bodies. Speaking of the ancient elemental world, consisting of the elements of air, earth, water, and fire, in his famous Confessions, Augustine says, I quote, "I ask the breezes which blow the entire air with it." Yes. "I ask the breezes which blow, and the entire air with its inhabitants said, Anaximenes was wrong, he was mistaken, I am not God." End of quote. For Augustine, as for Plato before him, and this for me is an insult a little bit because Anaximenes is my dearest friend, the question of the soul could no longer be connected to those elemental and thus fundamentally material and naturally underpinned layers of our being in the world. We know from the pre-Socratics that the ancient Greeks were immersed in the elemental world, surrounded by divinities, mysteries, and the depths of nature. But magical, if this is a magical worldview, here refers to cosmic correspondences and a vital soul, which, as in Anaximenes' famous fragment that you can see, can only be understood within this framework. Psyche, pneuma, aer are the words of this fragment. These are the denominators of this airy and still living soul. In other traditions, corresponding concepts are known as ruach, nefesh, prana, atman, chi, ki, ik, nilchi, sila, mana, orenda, and in my own Slovenian language, dusha, which is very breathy. Words such as spirit, pneuma, psyche, soul, anima, esprit, Geist, Holy Ghost, and so forth, inspiration, they are among the most significant concepts of European culture, yet not because of their hidden links to breath, but because of their supposedly immaterial foundation. Next section, the prophecy of Klages and a question of artificial minds. The first Western thinker to become fully aware of this unfortunate forgetting was Ludwig Klages. In his Der Geist als Widersacher der Seele from 1929, The Spirit as Adversary of the Soul, he proposes an entirely new reflection on the dependence of consciousness upon the phenomenon of life. The aim of his work is to demonstrate the ontological, epistemological, and especially environmental consequences of the unfortunate Greek transition from psyche to nous, a process of distancing ourselves from life and its inherent bodily psychical potentialities. The destiny of the soul is thus the history of a gradual distancing from material and elemental layers, and therefore from the rich reservoirs of sensibility. Why is this relevant to our question concerning technology? Because in his reflections on the distinction between human and artificial minds, Anil Seth points to precisely the same issue. Let us see the following excerpt. He says, "It is phoba, the feeling of being alive. At the heart of every conscious experience, there may be a shapeless, formless, but fundamental feeling of being alive. Greek psyche linked soul to breath, while Hindu Atman pointed toward witnessing awareness beneath thought. Both are grounded in life, and they point to an ancient intuition about what we fundamentally are, more breath than thought and more meat than machine. Feeling alive also means dreaming, having mystical or paranormal, if you wish, experiences like telepathy. Yes, it also means suffering, experiencing both our fragility and vulnerability and those of others. It means caring, praying, hoping for the impossible, contemplating, meditating for the sake of other beings, not for the sake of myself, including other sentient beings. This now brings us to the decisive question concerning the future of technology. The title of my next section is The Intention of Technology. Since the invention of the first tools, our predecessors have sought to adapt their environment to the increasingly sophisticated needs of the human species, from the earliest use of stones and sharpened wooden implements to the most advanced technological inventions. We know from Heidegger that one of the defining features of modern humanity is encapsulated in the concepts of Machenschaft, machination, like coercive force, power, mastery, a tendency that also extends to technology. Heidegger urges us to reorient ourselves towards another path, namely one guided by Haris, understood as mildness of being. In his now famous and widely cited 1954 essay, The Question Concerning Technology, he argues that in its essence, technology is a mode of revealing, and as such comes into presence with the realm in which revealing and unconcealment, aletheia, or truth, happens. According to him, techne belongs to bringing forth, to poiesis. It is something poetic, and it is not demonic, but its essence remains mysterious. So, technology is not demonic, but when its poetic, elemental core is blocked or veiled by the powers of machination or by techno-capital, it may reveal itself as the most destructive and demonic force imaginable. This is what I fear most today, the possibility that technology itself, as it were, may take the initiative away from human beings, our intentions, from the proliferation of large language machines, models, and similar AI systems, to the development of, example, increasingly dangerous weapons. Now let me go to my next section, the flattening of our soul and a reserve of breath. Just give me a second. Let me return one more time to the question of the soul. Surrounded by technology, we as human beings are part of a rapid acceleration that is transforming our worldviews and habits so quickly that there is a danger of a new forgetting, the forgetting of the human soul as such. As we witness the immersion of increasing numbers of individuals, especially children, into the one-dimensional space-time of the digital, the process of the flattening of the soul is already affecting the ways in which we encounter other human beings, animals, and nature. This is why a new impulse is needed, an energy of, as it were, a new spiritual force capable of securing an autonomy of being beyond the merely pure little world of the digital. In my favorite philosopher's book, Luz Irigaray, A New Culture of Energy, and this this kind of theory of the reserve of breath was first published in our journal Polygraph in 2010, so it is kind of an older origin. She writes the following: to become aware of the fact that our life exists thanks to our own breathing is essential for making an autonomous living persons. So breath is, for her, related to autonomy. But we cannot live only at the level of elementary vitality. We must take charge of our life and transform it into human existence. And this requires us to maintain and develop our breathing and also to provide ourselves with a reserve of available breath, a soul. So this is the definition of a soul that I could subscribe to. The genealogy of the soul, apart from being rooted in ancient cosmological and elemental layers, is therefore linked to something even more important, the reserve of breath. A humanity that has lost this reserve is endangered and risks being reduced to a mere artifact, already a relic within the technological spectacle of the contemporary age. The reserve of breath secures for us an ethical place in this world, a space of autonomy, difference, and interval that guards us against being appropriated by persons by other human beings or technology itself. The reserve of breath offers protection to our fragile souls. In its ontological sense, the reserve of breath marks the very threshold of our subjectivity. It guarantees the autonomy of the soul before it can be appropriated or seized by external forces. The reserve manifests itself in many ways. We can find it in the Genesis of the Old Testament, in the very first passages, then in both works of Jesus and Buddha, who first shared the reserve of their vital spiritual breath with a small number of women and men, their closest respiratory allies and friends within the intimacy of an archaic respiratory community, Sangha and Ecclesia. The reserve of breath enables our souls and bodies to cultivate the most precious endowments we possess, the possibility of an original place for breath, one that allows for the emergence of the gentle gestures of mindfulness, compassionate speech, meditation, prayer, listening, and also silence. Now, ontologically, the reserve of breath should be understood as a sign or a threshold toward imagining a future and a common destiny of humankind, toward which I believe our accomplishment and spiritual fulfillment should spiral, despite tragic or even horrific events in which this reserve has been or could be radically endangered. As in the events, as I interpret in one of my recent books, such as the death of Jesus Christ, when this reserve has been tragically or kind of endangered for 2 days, and then when after the resurrection it was kind of renewed. Then the Holocaust, if we read Paul Celan, Atemwende, cycle of poems, especially Das Atemkristall, or in another sense, the impending climate catastrophe of the Anthropocene, when we are like facing wildfires, dust storms, industrial pollution, smoke, intoxication, even I can't breathe was mentioned today. Or related to the AI, a possible future technological or digital singularity. In all these processes, AI is not a new oracle. The true oracle remains indwelling within our bodies and souls, breathing gently in a rhythm of love and unity. To conclude now, I will skip this. What is a soul then? Let me offer you a highly interesting citation from Kakyo, Zeami's most important work on Japanese aesthetics. Zeami Motokiyo was a Japanese aesthetician, actor, and playwright, influenced by Zen. Kakyo is his important work on the essence of not theater, and we are in this setting, I think that we are very close to the theater. Symbolically, a reflection on theater can, in my opinion, represent the essence of our intersubjective relations, and even more importantly, help us to understand the respiratory, or in this case, atmospheric nature of the soul versus the possibility of the AI in this regard. The citation reads as follows. When the actor enters stage in a sarugaku performance and begins the opening speech or issei passage, There will be a peak for that moment. Too early is wrong. Too late will be wrong. To begin with, the actor leaves the green room, walks onto the Hashigakari, the bridge connecting the backstage to the main stage, and stops. He then takes in all directions, and he should speak just for the audience holds with anticipation the thought. There, he is going to speak. This is the opportune moment that corresponds to the feeling of the audience. And this feeling and spirit of the audience is precisely the Japanese or Sino-Japanese chi or ki of the spectators. So he literally, the opportune moment, the precise moment which cannot be missed for a, not second, but for an infinitesimal small portion of time, is only what he can feel when he's in this attunement with the body of the spectators. And this paragraph is extraordinary. It brings to the fore the most important elements of the intersubjective and gestural conversation I wish to highlight. The threshold between the no-actor and audience indicates the conversational breath space, an atmosphere of our co-being with others, with Merleau-Ponty we could say flesh of the world, or as I wanted to put it in this lecture, a soul. I'm convinced that one of the keys of understanding the future questions of the AI and its relationship to the human psyche or soul lies precisely in the notion of this breath space or atmosphere as related to the meaning of envelopes, feelings, or attunements beyond entities. And the question, will AI ultimately be able to feel this chi or this space? I would answer that hardly not. So thank you very much.
Is Professor Jenke from the Distinguished Technical University of Munich, where he's a professor of ethics of artificial intelligence and neuroscience. He is very well known for his highly influential also at the policy level work on neuroethics, and today he'll speak precisely about that. His title is Humanity at the Crossroads, Cognitive Technology and the Future of Freedom and Autonomy. It's also a great pleasure to finally meet you in person, though we're in the same country. We never had the chance to meet, so looking forward to our now starting conversations.
That's correct.
Welcome.
It takes Delphi to get two Germans meet together.
I know. Greece and Germany, it's an old philosophy love story. So looking forward.
There you go. So thank you very much. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here in front of you to speak in this beautiful place about the future of humanity. And there couldn't be a best place to talk about the future of humanity than Delphi. So my presentation will try to address this question about the future of humanity from a very specific perspective. Namely, what happens to the future of humanity when we open the gates of our brains to the digital world, and when the digital world becomes part of what we think, and also it establishes a direct interface with our neural substrate. So I'm using this terminology of cognitive technology, which is a technology that I've been using for the last decade. It's not a very successful terminology, but I do think it's useful to understand a phenomenon of inherent duality that we have at the interface of neuroscience and artificial intelligence today. Because if you look at the history of AI over the last few years, you see that AI has been interacting with human cognition in two ways. On the one hand, human cognition is being used to understand and improve artificial intelligence. So-called neuro-inspired or neuromorphic AI systems are systems that are designed in a way that mimics or simulates aspects of human cognition. But at the same time, AI has been increasingly used to understand and improve human cognition. This is the field of neurotechnology, where we use computational tools and recently, increasingly, AI systems to basically do two things: to read out from the brain and understand how the brain operates at the functional and biological level, and also to influence the brain because we have technologies today, so-called neural interfaces, that can do these two things simultaneously. So neural interfaces are basically electronic devices that can be placed on the outside or inside of the brain or other parts of the nervous system to do these two things, to record brain activities, so read out from the brain, or stimulate neural activities, so right into the brain in a quite literal sense, so using electrical waves to modulate brain function. And if we look at these trends of cognitive technology and neural interfaces specifically from an historical perspective, and also from the perspective of a field of science that goes under the name of proxemics, which is the study of how humans use the physical space, I think we can see a trend, namely a trend towards an increasing proximity of artificial intelligence systems around the human body. So AI systems originated in a world where AI software was run on supercomputers that were pretty much detached from the human body. Think about AI-based chess playing software from the 1980s and 90s. In recent years, we have integrated AI capabilities into everyday objects that operate in close proximity with the human body, like smartphones, which I believe many of you have in their pockets right now, just like myself. And then we have integrated them even more closely to the human body. We made them touch the human body. They are adjacent to the human body when they are integrated into AI-powered wearables. And the next frontiers is actually embedding AI systems not in technologies that operate close to us, but in technologies that operate inside us, and specifically that operate at the interface with the human brain. And this is the technologies that go under the name of brain-computer interfaces, which are the specific neural interfaces that directly interface the brain. And the interesting thing about brain-computer interfaces is that they are the most direct application of artificial intelligence into the cognitive architecture of the person. So they are the most intimate relationship between human cognition and artificial intelligence. And now, this has philosophical implications. We heard the famous Descartes quote, cogito ergo sum. So we know that if we buy the cogito ergo sum maxim, then if you have technologies that can influence the way we think by interfacing cognition at the ultimate biological level, this has implications for our own sense of existence, but it also has quite direct implications for ethics and decision making. Because if we have this intimate interaction between AI systems and cognition, this raises novel challenges that we haven't faced before. I don't know how many of you have been sitting in a self-driving car, but if you have been sitting in a self-driving car and you see this vehicle moving autonomously, and you see the vehicle going in a different direction than what you have expected or intended to go, you're perfectly capable of identifying this discrepancy before the intentionality of your original trajectory and the self-driving vehicles going in a different direction, right? And we can do that because even though we are sitting into mobilized AI systems, we retain the cognitive ability to know the direction that we want to pursue and then identify a mismatch if the vehicle is going in a different direction. I'm afraid we don't have that ability anymore when AI algorithms operate within the cognitive architecture of a human. So when we embed AI algorithms inside brain-computer interfaces, humans may lose the ability to identify that there is a mismatch between what the AI is doing and what the AI is intending to do and what the human agent originally planned to do. And AI is being integrated into neural interfaces to do those two things that I mentioned before, readout from the brain. This is what we call AI decoding. We can now use AI systems to decode a large variety of cognitive and other mental processes, including vision, silent speech, continuous language, and we also have models, so-called mind captioning models, that are attempting to recreate AI-mediated inferences about entire mental states. This is what goes under the name of mind captioning. I just want to give you an example of what visual decoding through AI systems can do. This is an approach to AI called stable diffusion. It's being used widely by researchers, especially in Japan, actually, to reconstruct the visual content of mental states from neural activity. So the experiment works in the following way. You have people whose brain activity is being recorded while they're looking at a specific visual stimulus. In this case, they're looking at these images that you see on top. Their brain activity is being recorded, and an artificial neural network is being trained to reconstruct the content of the mental states without having access to the stimulus itself. The algorithm only has access to the underlying brain activity of people who are looking at the teddy bear. And then this is what the algorithm can reconstruct. So if you look at the teddy bear, the algorithm can reconstruct an image of this quality, which is quite remarkable. I guess many of you can see these images. They're not as sophisticated as the real image, but this is already an incredible achievement for science. And of course, we can use AI not just to decode from the brain, but also to write into the brain through a process known as neurostimulation. You can use electrical waves to influence brain activity, and you can use AI tools to decide when to stimulate, where to stimulate, so which brain region, and with which intensity. So this is all quite remarkable, but this is actually a present instantiation of an idea that has been much older than the technology itself. There is one of the fathers of modern computer science, J.C.R. Licklider, who wrote in the 1960s a very prophetic article entitled Man-Computer Symbiosis. And in this article, he argued and hoped that in not too many years, I'm quoting, human brains and computing machines will be coupled very tightly, and the resulting partnership will think as no human brain has ever thought and process data in a way not approached by the information handling machines we know today. So if you know the history of AI, you know that it's full of bad predictions. Even the smartest people like Herbert Simon were predicting in the 1950s that we would have artificial superintelligence by the 1970s. And they were incredibly wrong. But this is actually one of the few predictions in the history of AI that came true, because only 13 years after this prediction, we had the first animal models of brain-computer interfacing, and 38 years after this prophetic prediction, we had the first human being implanted with the brain-computer interface. Now it's 2026, and the field of brain-computer interfacing is spillovering outside of the clinical and biomedical research domain into what I've called the neurocapitalism economy. So an economy in which we can utilize artificial intelligence mediated brain-computer interfaces as general personalized technologies for consumer use. You see here just a few of the many applications that are currently on the market. We conducted an extensive reviews of those. And I also want to emphasize that it's not just the neurotechnology companies that are playing this game, it's actually the entire big tech industry. And just this year, Apple has patented the incorporation of electroencephalography, which is a way to measure electrical activity in the brain, into the next generation of AirPods, which is an exciting achievement because soon we will be able to collect data from millions of people simultaneously, which is a huge achievement for neuroscience, but as you can understand, is also a major challenge for ethics, the law, and society. So let's go back to the metaphor by J.C.R. Licklider, and let's take it seriously. Because the biologists in the room know that the word symbiosis has a very specific meaning in biology. Is when two species interact in a way that they live together in a manner that can be either mutualistic or parasitic. And a mutualistic symbiosis is when two species interact in a manner that they both profit from the interaction, whereas parasitic is when one species is better off at the end of the interaction, whereas the other one is worse off. So a typical example of parasitic symbiosis is our relationship with mosquitoes. This is the Anopheles mosquito, which is the carrier of malaria, which kills every year hundreds of thousands of people worldwide. And this is, of course, a parasitic interaction because we don't profit at all from this interaction. We get only the worst out of it, whereas the mosquito gets a free meal. A type of mutualistic symbiosis is instead the relationship between bees and flowers. This is a win-win because the flower gets pollinated, so it gets propagation and reproduction, and then again the bee gets a free meal. So the decisive question for humanity in the field of neuroscience and AI, from my point of view, is what kind of interaction are we going to establish between human cognition and artificial AI systems? Is this going to be a symbiosis like Licklider said? And if so, is it going to be a parasitic or a mutualistic symbiosis? And I want to give you a few examples to show you that some forms of mutualistic symbiosis are already happening. So these are two examples of brain-computer interfacing in the field of clinical medicine that have the potential to massively revolutionize human health. The example you see here is a brain-to-speech interface that can allow a patient with full aphasia. She's a patient with amyotrophic lateral sclerosis who, as a consequence of this neurodegenerative disease, has completely lost the ability to speak. And through this brain-to-speech interface, she can basically speak on behalf of an AI avatar that can read her brain activity in real time. And in this video, she was just having her first conversation with a spouse. This is revolutionary for a lot of people with this kind of disability. Again, this is another example of mutualistic symbiosis. This is a brain-to-spine interface that can allow patient with a spinal cord injury. Like this patient here is a young man who is being completely tetraplegic as a consequence of the disease. And basically what the interface can do is to bypass the lesion. So it can neurostimulate neural function post-lesion in order to allow this patient to take these first historical steps. But we also have the counterpart, and the counterpart is the parasitic interaction. For example, this is a US company called BrainCo that has been pilot testing brain surveillance technology in elementary school in China, allegedly with the positive goal of identifying children with ADHD, with attention deficit and hyperactivity syndrome. So the technology works as a kind of traffic light system. If the light is green, it means the child is paying attention. If it's red, it means they're spacing out. But this is, of course, a vulnerable population, and there is a massive data collection without the consent of the users. We also have a massive problem of generating unrealistic expectations in the population. You might know this man who is heavily involved in one of the key neurotechnology companies called Neuralink, and he has been making very pompous claims like this one, that their Neuralink product will enable people with paralysis to use a smartphone with their minds faster than people using thumbs. And this is already leading to negative consequences for people in the real world. Like in our own research, we reported the case of a patient who committed suicide, who attempted to commit suicide, likely didn't die, as a consequence of these unrealistic expectations. Because then when the technology underperformed compared to the expectations that the patient had, then the patient had a feeling of extreme despair. And last but not least, I also want to mention the risk of potential changes to the preferences of the user. This, for example, is a medical report from the Netherlands of a patient who underwent a neurostimulation technique called deep brain stimulation. And after the stimulation, the patient had a different musical preference, specifically developed a persistent obsessive preference for the music of Johnny Cash, which It's good news, but this is not what the patient was stimulated for. The patient was actually stimulated in order to reduce tremor related to Parkinson's disease. And the problem here is that we don't know why the technology induced this change of preferences, in this specific sense, musical preferences. But we cannot rule out that a similar intervention in the future could lead to modifications of other preferences, such as political or religious preferences, that are more constitutive of the personal identity of the user. And most importantly, this is a case of off-target effect, meaning it was not intended, but what if people will want to use the technology in the future to obtain intended effects? For example, neurotechnology makers who have a very specific political agenda of democratic destabilization. So we are at crossroads. And in the concluding part of my presentation, I will try to indicate a possible way to go through this sunny path of mutualistic symbiosis with AI systems, and not this path of basically human rights erosion as a consequence of a parasitic interaction with that. And the framework that a colleague of mine, Roberto Andorno, and myself have been developing is the so-called neural rights framework, which is basically the subset of human rights pertaining to the brain and mind domain of human beings. And this is really predicated upon the idea that the rights and freedoms of the human person largely depend on the rights and freedoms that people can exercise with regard to their brains. And we have identified 4 main families of rights that are at stake here. The first one being cognitive liberty, which is the fundamental freedom of every person to exercise autonomous control over their own brain and mental processes, including the right to permit or refuse access to, monitoring of, or modulation of those processes. So it's basically a principle of mental self-determination, or if you like it better, it's basically an operationalization of the right to freedom of thought, which is a right that is codified in international human rights law, but it's hardly invoked. And when it was invoked, was mostly in conjunction with freedom of religion and freedom of expression. But here, we are at the time where we need to protect thought, not just through the operationalization of thought or externalization of thought, but actually thought itself at the forum internum, at the neurobiological level. And potential risks for cognitive liberty emerge from non-consented uses of the technology, like coercive uses of the technology, which are already reported in the military setting. The #1 funder of neurotechnology worldwide is the military sector. So we are seeing already the weaponization of these technologies. But some violations of cognitive liberty could also emerge out of using the wrong AI algorithms to optimize the functionalities of the systems in a way that can override the intentionality of the users. And we are now conducting the largest study in the world addressing the subjective experience of end users of these technologies, and we're already seeing several reports of feeling of estrangement and alienations in systems that are heavily optimized through AI systems. And this is particularly challenging from an ethical perspective because the AI algorithms that we are using in this field are primarily opaque, non-transparent AI systems. Actually, explainable AI systems were used in less than 10% of all the technologies utilized. The next problem is mental privacy, which is everyone's right and ability to control whether information about their brain activity, mental states, and cognitive processes is collected, inferred, accessed, used, or disclosed. This is, again, not a problem in the future. It's already there. So this is a study that demonstrated the feasibility of re-identifying people based on their brain scans by cross-aggregating a database of brain scans, specifically magnetic resonance imaging, with publicly available images from social media. And these were people who had no awareness that they could be re-identifiable through their brain activity. But there is also a bigger sense at which mental privacy is at stake. As I told you before, we can use AI decoding to basically read out from the brain and reconstruct processes such as continuous language. This is a very remarkable study because this study was capable of reconstructing continuous language from people at a very high speed and using the GPT model, so using a commercially available large language model. And it could do that with very high accuracy and very high speed. That's why Nature, the most important journal in the scientific community, not exactly Vogue, has been publishing several editorials and news features on the topic of mind reading, something that was widely considered to be part of science fiction. Second last is mental integrity. Here, very simple. Anytime you connect something to a computer, you make it vulnerable to the same vulnerabilities of a computer. So if you connect the human brain to a computer, you make it vulnerable of the same vulnerabilities of a computer. And here's a study in which we proved that it is possible to actually hack brain-computer interfaces in order to extract information without the compliance and awareness of the user. And last but not least, psychological continuity, which is the right to preserve one's personal identity and the continuity of the mental life from non-consensual external alteration by third parties. This is something that we've seen before. It can happen if the AI system is overriding your intentionality or if you're having off-target effects. But actually, we observed in our own research that this is something that can also happen if you explant the device. So this is a study in which we actually interviewed the first patient in the world who had to undergo what we call a non-voluntary explantation of a brain-computer interface. Why non-voluntary? Because she wanted to keep the device. She was very happy with the device. She was a patient with epilepsy that was using an advisory BCI that could alert her when an epileptic seizure was coming, which is a life-saving measure. Imagine if you're driving in the highway and you're alerted that an epileptic seizure is coming, this can be life-saving. But so why did she have to have the device removed? Because the company that was producing the device, Vista, went bankrupt. And if the company that is manufacturing your device goes bankrupt, you have nobody that will protect you. The device will remain unmaintained, and a non-maintained device is going to lead to infection, bleeding, and ultimately death. So she had to have it removed. But after having the device removed, she reported experiences of agential discontinuity, so a persistent traumatic harm linked to the continuity of herself. So I just want to conclude with informing you that in this last decade, this idea of neural rights has been translated into governance. For example, the 2019 OECD recommendation. In 2020, Chile in South America was the first country to introduce a constitutional reform that introduced a law on mental privacy and neuroprotection. Several states in the United States have done the same, such as California and Colorado. And the Council of Europe is now developing guidelines to interpret their Convention 108, which is the data protection regulation. And last but not least, UNESCO adopted in November 2025, so less than a year ago, the first global recommendation on the ethics of neurotechnology, which set the first UN-level standard in this field. So we are here at the time where we already have some international and intergovernmental governance, which is very robust, but we're still, we have a gap ahead because this has not been translated into national law, especially in legally binding frameworks. It has not been translated in standards for designers and manufacturers, and it has not been translated into responsible innovation concepts. So this is what we need to do. I just want to conclude with two taken messages, which I believe sum up my presentation. The first one is that neural rights and freedoms are the precondition for all other freedoms. I think this is a fundamental issue for the future of humanity. If we cannot exercise our rights and freedoms at the level of our thought, of our cognition, then we cannot exercise all the other freedoms and rights that depend on that. And the second one is that AI should upgrade and not degrade humans. Thank you very much for your attention.
So many thanks to our speakers, and we still have time for a couple of questions. Someone will be there with a microphone, so who wants to go first? I see a hand there. Yes, please. Yes, microphone is coming.
Thank you very much for this presentation. It was incredible. I just have a quick question, and I haven't given it much thought, but I think we're opening new avenues for a new kind of criminology. And what is the authority that will regulate this new kind of, let's say, liberties to enter territories that are very unknown to us? Yeah, we spoke about the law and regulations, but what happens? You opened like a vast array of questions that I think you can't quite answer, or I hope you can. But thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for your question. This is actually a very good question, because I didn't talk much about the forensic uses of neurotechnology in my presentation, but this is also an increasing phenomenon. So actually there was an editorial in Science recently that actually elicited an article in the New York Times by a journalist named Moens. He actually reported the increasing use of a brain monitoring technology called BOS, which measures brain oscillations, which apparently has been widely used in courts, especially in India, in order to assess whether individuals have experiential knowledge of a crime. Now, there is no consensus in the neuroscience community at all that a technology like that can tell you whether you are informed about a crime, let alone if you have experiential knowledge of a crime. But the technology is being widely used in several hundreds, if not thousands, of proceedings. And now many other countries, Indonesia and Singapore most recently, are actually interested in using this technology. And this is, again, not just a practical issue, it's also a fundamental legal philosophical issue, because it raises the question about whether people should have the right to decline the use of this technology, in particular because, in my opinion, the use of this technology would violate the principle, the right against self-incrimination. Why? So there is a right against self-incrimination that says you should allow to not to say anything that can lead to your own incrimination, right? So you have the right to stay silent. That right doesn't apply to some forms of physiological testing. So for example, if you have a genetic test, you cannot decline that. But these technologies are actually looking at entire sentences. So it's way more similar to a testimony than it is to a genetic test, in my view. And therefore, I think we should be extremely cautious with the use of this technology.
Thank you very much to both speakers for very interesting speeches. For Mr. Škof, I have a question. In Greek, we also have the word pneuma, spirit, esprit. How does that relate with the psyche as you described it? And for Mr. Yenka, you talked about symbiosis, and your examples showed living organisms. With AI, do we actually have a living organism in symbiosis with the human? And also related to this, you show us the relationship between patient and AI. The patient benefits. How does AI benefits from that relationship? Thank you.
So I'll be brief. Yes, of course, pneuma is all. Okay. Yes, I will do it. Pneuma is one of the words already in the most ancient era, so it was mentioned already. But one of our institute members, a PhD, former candidate of Panagiotis, Ροϊλός, wrote an excellent PhD, and now he will publish a book within our book series on how pneuma was, again, completely forgotten by Augustine, and how intensio and this, became a central kind of term of European philosophy all until Husserl by forgetting pneuma. So this is a huge topic, which of course I know, but I cannot, But I would also like to add maybe just briefly that you perfectly know Hans Jonas and his book from 1979. He predicted that we don't have an ethics in 1979 that could guard us towards technology. And I think that today we also do not have yet ethics that kind of could answer to the vulnerability of the soul, which was my intention in my today's talk.
I'll be very brief in responding to the question. It's clear that the patient benefits from AI. How does AI benefits from the question? Without being provocative, I would actually say it's more obvious that AI always benefits from an interaction with humans because it gets data, and AI needs data in order to be trained and in order to improve. It's not always so obvious that humans benefit from AI use. So in the medical setting, most patients benefit from AI, but outside of medical settings, we see a lot of AI benefiting from human data and very few humans benefiting from AI.
Who benefits from this AI benefiting from human mind? So this is to do with neurocapitalism, doesn't it? To understand.
Cui bono?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's very interesting to see that even very distant technologies, you were talking about space exploration, and I was talking about neuroscience, they seem to have the same individuals backing up these markets. So Mr. Musk is heavily involved in the neurotechnology sector and in the space industry, and I think this is no coincidence at all.
Avi.
Your assumption was that in laying out these principles is that humans are in control, which was the case, of course, in the legal system in the past. So when you lay out the ethical principles, we can follow them in principle. But once you introduce an interface with AI into the human brain, the AI may be in control, and it will not necessarily follow your ethical principles because the AI has a different incentive. And so how do we verify that we are not being controlled once we put it into our brain by a different set of principles that do not care at all about what you laid out?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And this is precisely the reason why we believe we need to ask this question now, because we don't have widespread implantation of brain-computer interfaces as of now. We still have a few hundreds of thousands of patients with very specific conditions, but the time window is restricting very fast. So I think the fundamental question is, should we do that? And if so, under which conditions? And under which conditions means in which settings, in which domains of human activity, but it also means which AI. What requirements should these AI systems to have in order?
So I have 3 more fingers, which I will take, and then I do a cutoff, if that's okay, if the president agrees. Okay, good. Okay, good. Okay, let's see how many fingers I shall cut under the presidency of Professor Ροϊλός. But first, the AI colleague from Patras, please.
Okay. Thank you for providing me some time to make a couple of points and a question. It was a question a while ago about the benefit. Based on some reports I have seen, in 2035 it will be a market on AI, including all these things we are discussing here, around 700 billion USD. 700 billion USD. The first one. The second one is it's something missing in our discussion. Missing is a name, Alan Turing. Alan Turing, which in 1950, based on mathematical reasoning, put the basis of AI with a question. can a machine think? This is the second one. And because it was a very interesting presentation in different directions from the two colleagues here, BCI, symbiosis, and all these kind of things. I would like to ask a question here. Under which conditions two different biological systems could go to a symbiosis? I mean, the biological system, the human, the nature as we know, and the new nature as it is coming on. I mean, the technical. So we have two biological systems. Symbiosis means to live together, means two different biological states. How, under which conditions do you think? I have seen from Professor Li Hui Wang in KTH a model of BCI, moving a robot using this technology. What do you think about that?
Maybe, that's a great idea. Let's move to, we'll listen to all the questions, and then, the lady, and then the economist. Yeah.
As a journalist from television, I would like to make some very simple questions. So, Professor Škof, you used a lot of Greek words, like psyche, like phobo, etc. I think we are breathless with all the developments of AI. Will AI let us think at the end of the day? Because I fear, έχω το φόβο, I have the phobo, that it will not let us think, and it doesn't have soul. That's what most of the journalists, usually we say fake news. We wouldn't like, today we wouldn't like to disperse any fake news. Real news from you about that. This is one question. And the other for Mr. Yenka. Really, it's the first time I hear so interesting news about AI. Can you please let us know really, we heard about the mental privacy. Are you optimistic that shall we be able to end up with privacy, mental privacy? Thank you.
And last but not least, the gentleman over there.
Okay, thank you to my dear first speaker. A simple question, what is the future of psyche? Is there any future for psyche at all?
Okay, that was a good question. Yeah. So you can do yes or no, or be sophisticated about this. But you're both free in answering in any way. Please, go ahead. Maybe you will.
Okay. Okay, let me answer to both questions because they're very, very close to each other. Well, if we are pessimistic, of course, there is... Yes, sorry. If we are pessimistic, of course, there is no nothing can save us, but we are not so pessimistic. For Ilia Delio, for example, she writes about the deep AI, which would be kind of a post-axial, because she thinks that we have a pre-axial age, we have axial age, and somehow we are stuck in these models of axial age, which is from, according to Jaspers, from beginning of the 5th century BC. And we need a post-axial paradigm and so forth. And I like very much Dana Zohar, her theory of three intelligences like IQ, EQ, and SQ. And if we would, for example, test Elon Musk, you know that he would perform perfectly on IQ, but on EQ and SQ he would perform badly. And if you would take, I don't know, Jesus Christ, if that would be possible, to take this test, he would probably perform much, much better on EQ, like emotional intelligence, and SQ, spiritual intelligence, highly and possibly the best of the best. And I think that, humanities, if there will not be, of course, like at the University of Exeter, if they will not fire us, everyone, then we could do something, together with philosophy, theology, religious studies, anthropology, psychology, and so forth, to redirect, what is going on. It will be a hard kind of battle because the capital is very, very strong. But we know that we have fought some wars, in the history as intellectuals, and I would not kind of surrender so easily. Yeah.
It's tempting to say something about Jesus' IQ now, but I won't. So please.
That's a strong cliffhanger for tomorrow's discussion. I'll probably start with a question about Alan Turing, because you're absolutely right. We probably wouldn't be here talking about artificial intelligence without him. The question, can machines think, has shaped the field of artificial intelligence, and we were having actually a conversation about this yesterday. I personally believe that it's possible to have non-conscious, soulless cognitive systems, but I think we should really start pairing this question with another question which is equally important, namely, not can machines think, but can machines change the way we think? And I think this is a very important question that is quite underlooked. The second question was, am I optimistic? I think I will respond with a quote here as well from Italian Marxist philosopher Antonio Gramsci. While he was jailed by the fascist regime, he said we should have the pessimism of the reason and the optimism of the will. And I think this is a very good attitude to have towards technology. The pessimism of the reason means that if we look at how the AI ecosystem is developing under something that I wouldn't hesitate to call a techno-fascist framework, I would be very pessimistic, but on the other hand, technology is not predetermined. It's determined by humans, and therefore we absolutely need to have the optimism of the will to imagine ways to completely reshape the way AI is developed, utilized, and implemented.
Well. So I think this concludes the first day of the Delphi Dialogues, and looking forward to more of that.